Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Kent Thoelke. He is Chief Innovation Officer at ICON, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, Accelerated by COVID-19, Technology Carves New Pathways for Everyone to Access Healthcare. Kent, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Kevin.
We'll get into the article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Sure. So, I started in bench research about 35 years ago and thought I wanted to be a biochemist and spent about 6 months on a bench and realized that lab science was a really bad thing for me. And so I was with a multinational company and got offered the job to move into clinical development and really just expanded my career from there. I spent a number of years in small and emerging biotech companies, creating some novel therapies for patients. Back in those days, it was really early days for clinical development. FDA really didn't have a strong framework. And so it was a little bit of the Wild West, but we were getting all sorts of novel medications to patients that really for a long time didn't have adequate care. And so that really started my journey. I moved into global contract research organizations after that and spent about the last 15, 20 years really focused in that space. And that's working with a multitude of pharma and biotech clients around the world, as well as physicians and their practices to get clinical trials out to as many patients as possible, depending on the disease state. And I would say that, likely in the last decade, I have really spent most of my time focused around patient centricity and how do we expand access both to patients, but also to physicians, so that we can make clinical research a care option for all patients as opposed to the minority of patients. And that's really been kind of where my passion lies today, is how do we get more patients access to better care.
So I'm an internal medicine physician, and the majority of this audience are practicing clinicians. Now, what are some things about clinical trials that practicing clinicians need to know, but a lot of them don't?
I think the first thing is just knowing that they're there. So the majority of patients out there get standard of care. The majority of clinicians in the US and around the world are not in major metropolitan cities. So their knowledge and access to trials is limited. So we have kind of two challenges. One, the pharma and biotech companies and CROs really need to place studies with clinicians that are in probably non-traditional areas, rural areas, non-academic or major medical centers. But the other thing that physicians need to really do is spend some time on their own, really exploring what trials are available for their patients. There's lots of resources out there. ClinicalTrials.gov is probably the major resource out there that physicians can search for their patients by disease state, by inclusion criteria, et cetera. I think most physicians are probably turned off or concerned that the volume of work involved in participating in a trial is quite high. I think we have really worked hard in the industry to make it more streamlined. And so I think that physicians just need to take that first step. But really the first thing is just doing your research to understand what's available and out there for your patient based on their disease.
Now, in general, what specialties of medicine are clinical trials most available to?
Everywhere, everything. So I think that originally, clinical trials back 20, 30 years ago really focused on patients that were at their last ditch effort and just throwing anything at them to try to save their lives. So in diseases that were acutely terminal, many of them oncology and rare diseases, you would see patients offered clinical trials as like a last effort. I think what we've seen over the last couple of decades is that has really moved up in the paradigm. So where therapies may have been third or fourth line for patients, really today, most of them are add-on therapies to first or second line. We still certainly do trials in patients that have failed all other approved therapies, but that model has really changed. And so when we think about best possible care, when we think about clinical research as a care option, trials have really moved into the forefront. So for really any patient by any disease state, there is likely a trial out there. I think what the physician needs to do with the patient is really assess whether or not that trial is the most appropriate option based on disease, mechanism of action, where they are, lifestyle, expectations for how they care for themselves and what kind of care they have. So it is a, I would say, multifactorial discussion, but really every disease is out there today.
And you did mention that it required a little bit of work to include a patient in a clinical trial. So I actually don't know too much about that. So just give me a sense of what kind of workflow is needed to include a patient in a clinical trial.
Well, of course, safety is paramount. So all clinical trials are regulated by various regulatory bodies around the world. In the U.S., it's the FDA. In Europe, it's the EMA, and there's regulatory bodies around the world, country by country, that really focus on the protection of subjects that participate in trials. As a part of that, like with everything, there are forms to fill out. So physicians have a number of regulatory forms that need to be filled out that make sure that they're licensed and educated and agree to control the patients in the trials. We check for things like lab certifications and a lot of the rote things that they do anyways, but likely don't have documented somewhere systematically. And so we have systems set up for that. So the support network, when a physician participates in a trial, can help them do all of that to make it a little bit easier. But there is some administrative work on the front end. The second piece is most of our clinical trials are quite defined. So the inclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria for who can participate in a trial are well scripted. And so it takes a little bit of effort for physicians and their staff to really go through charts and find patients that match appropriately for a trial. And then once that's all done, really, taking the time to explain to your patient what participating in a clinical trial means and the potential value to the patients and the broader patient community. So there is some extra time involved, but I would say that the benefits far outweigh the extra burden for the patients and for the physician for what they can offer their patients.
All right, so let's transition into the Kevin MD article that you wrote. This was back in March. It's titled Accelerated by COVID-19, Technology Carves New Pathways for Everyone to Access Healthcare. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read that article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Sure. So, when COVID happened almost overnight, 15 or 16 months ago, concerns around infection rates with COVID, physicians, medical centers, hospitals really limited access to patients coming in physically to these hospitals. And what that meant for patient care, and certainly for patients on clinical trials, was very rapidly we had to figure out a way to deploy these medications to these patients remotely, but then also continue to monitor those patients effectively to ensure both safety and that we could monitor the new drugs in testing for efficacy. And so simultaneously, what we saw across healthcare systems around the world was this shift to, where possible, moving patients into a telehealth, telemedicine, remote patient monitoring modality. So where physicians could, where practices could, if they already had technology that allowed for remote monitoring or telehealth, they implemented that for many of their patients. For clinical trials, we had to simultaneously adjust. So most of our trials did not allow for telemedicine or telehealth or remote patient monitoring. So simultaneously, where healthcare systems were deploying these methods, we integrated them to the clinical trials so that how we were conducting the trials matched how healthcare was being delivered. In many healthcare systems, we saw uptake of 1,000%, 2,000%. So where you had massive patient populations who were coming to the clinic for all of their experiences, they were now being treated at home, either remotely through telehealth or through home healthcare nursing. And so what COVID did was escalate something that we had thought was very important for a long time. So what we knew was in the US, as an example, only 3 to 5% of eligible patients participate in research. Much of that is access issues. It is complex for patients to participate in a clinical trial. It requires more effort to get to the clinic or the physician. It requires significantly more hours and time to do scans and labs and things like that. And so, for quite some time, we knew that if we could make access easier for patients, if we could lower the burden for patients, then we would allow more patients to participate. And what focused that was really decentralizing clinical trials through the use of these technologies. And so COVID allowed us the impetus to move not only healthcare, but clinical trials into more technology-focused space to allow patients to participate in research from wherever they are.
Now, can you tell us a story or paint us a picture of a specific clinical trial or drug that was administered using some of these remote technologies that you just described?
Sure. So I think there's two examples. I think generally speaking, rare and orphan diseases where patients live very far from potential clinics, those patients have little to no access to clinical trials in the current model. So the treatment paradigm we had is many of those families and patients had to transport their children, as an example, with an orphan disease, several states away just to get access to potential care. And so for many of those trials, we started deploying remote monitoring technologies, in-home healthcare nursing, telehealth, and telemedicine, in the last couple of years. So they were really on the forefront of many of these technologies. But then fast forward to COVID, we participated in a fully virtual clinical trial in heart failure. And so in that case, patients really never saw their physicians. So all of those patients were enrolled via healthcare systems, via a mobile platform. They were consented electronically. Their medication was shipped to them directly. We sent them devices to monitor their healthcare remotely that was centrally monitored by the physician who led the study. And all of that data was collected remotely. What was fascinating about that study, and we talk about access, is the number of patients that enrolled were significantly larger than in a normal heart failure trial. So in some cases, we saw enrollment 10 times faster than we would in a normal clinical trial. But what was most exciting and what we saw with COVID is that equity and access to healthcare by minority populations was significantly increased when we used that model. So we saw a broad range of diversity in those trials, upwards of 30%, where most of our trials probably only have a diversity quotient of 2 or 3%. So both of those trials really show that when we include these technologies, when we allow patients to have some access to their physician remotely, we can do clinical trials better and more efficiently.
We're talking to Kent Thoelke. He is Chief Innovation Officer at ICON, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, Accelerated by COVID-19, Technology Carves New Pathways for Everyone to Access Healthcare. Kent, hopefully we're entering the tail end of COVID. Now, do you see any of these remote technologies persisting going forward, even after COVID ends?
I think that, our hope is that many of these things stay sticky. I think what will manifest that is really reimbursement. So what we saw with groups like CMS and insurers was during COVID, many of these things like telehealth and telemonitoring visits were not reimbursed at the same rates as a traditional visit. Many of those things were changed during COVID so that physicians could participate in these types of technologies and still get reimbursement for those visits. I think it will remain to be seen whether or not those types of reimbursement approvals stay in effect. If they do, I think we have a much better opportunity to continue to see stickiness of these technologies. I think the other thing to remember is, healthcare is changing, access is changing, the requirements for physician, the time needed to see patients in clinic is changing. What the ability that telehealth and telemedicine and remote patient monitoring did was give physicians a lot more access to their patients in real time. And so, we're hoping that remote patient monitoring, as an example, becomes more mainstream, because I think that physicians that can more constantly evaluate a patient's disease provide better care as well. So if you think about a patient that has a chronic disease, those patients may only come in once every 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks, depending on their disease state. And those in-between periods, physicians are really reliant upon a patient or a caregiver for recall. So how did you feel the last, couple of months? And so what we know about patients is they're really poor at recall. And so if we can monitor those patients in real time during those empty periods when they're not in clinic and collect that data and provide that data to the physician or caregiver, it just gives them more information to provide better diagnostics, better care for those patients, and a better understanding of how their medications are treating their disease state. And so that all dovetails into how we do clinical research as well. And so I really am hoping that physicians take this opportunity to leverage those technologies in their daily care for their patients, because I think that it just provides better care.
Now, other than the reimbursement piece that you mentioned, what are some of the other obstacles that's preventing more clinical trials to include more remote technologies when it comes to garnering more applicants?
Well, healthcare systems that are very large, that have their own, chief information officers and IT departments and technology deployment groups, they do better because they have the infrastructure and support. So I think we will see widespread adoption in those major metropolitan cities and locations where hospitals have that infrastructure, where big clinics and tertiary medical centers have that infrastructure, because you need that to do it. I think for smaller practices, it's going to be more of a challenge. I think they'll need to align themselves either with national groups, you know, the national telehealth providers that are out there. I think it'll be a little more of a challenge for them. So I think that the adoption of the technology is probably the biggest barrier, because there is some investment required. But I think that will vary. I think my concern is probably where the need is the greatest. So in rural communities or spaces where, you know, patients are a couple hours from the nearest care, they are probably the last groups that will get access to these opportunities unless we focus on that. And that will require, you know, major medical systems, healthcare systems, to really expand their investment and outreach into those communities beyond kind of the traditional metropolitan markets.
And my final question, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
I think the take-home message is that clinical trials, drug development, provide patients options that they otherwise wouldn't have in standard of care. And in many cases, that care is better care. So when you think about trials that are very close to approval, there are medications out there that, based on disease state, based on mechanism of action, have a high likelihood of impacting a patient's quality of life or their longevity of life or their disease state. And so, you know, the take-home message is I really want physicians to take the time to educate themselves and look at the clinical trials that are out there and ask the questions and reach out to whoever's sponsoring those trials to see if they could potentially participate or get access to their patients for those trials. Because what we would like to do is make clinical research a care option for all patients, and not just the few patients that happen to be in the right place at the right time.
Kent, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.